across cultures and civilizations, humanity has always lived with shadows. And you may want to ask, which shadows am I describing? Well, I mean symbols, rituals, rites, and even leaders whose authority pointed to something greater than themselves. Ancient Egypt had its pharaohs, who they believed to be earthly images of divine beings. Rome also had its imperators, whose triumphal entries were designed to foreshadow the stability and order they promised. Even in our modern times, we see that nations still live by prototypes. In other words, they live by constitutions modeled after older ones, governments patterned after historical systems, monuments built to remind citizens of deeper ideals. So it is no surprise that in the United States of America, for example, when you move into cities like New York, within states like Washington and other places of memorable landmarks, you would quickly identify that they have a lot of similar structures like ancient Rome. Among all these shadows, none is as deliberate, structured, and theologically rich as the typological system God embedded into Israel's history. Well, as we go through today's lesson, it appears there are very interesting facts we would want to discover. And I'm very much interested in this episode because they remind me of the importance of systematic ways of analyzing things. We read, according to the text, that indeed types and antitypes are very important as we go through this episode. We would want to quickly understand how important Joshua has been in our discourse so far. And in order to make a correct symbolic interpretation of Joshua, we have to know some rules that govern biblical symbolism, which I've already mentioned, types and antitypes. Before we proceed, it is imperative that we go through these very important bullets in our discourse for today, and I would want you to be very critical and attentive because it's going to get very interesting. What are the biblical symbolisms that we are talking about here? In fact, we are looking at what typology is, and in essence, the classes of typology. It goes on for us to discover the symbolism of Joshua. And by doing so, we are looking at Joshua as a type, the antitype of Joshua, and Joshua as a type of the church. Let's delve deeper by looking at biblical symbolism. Well, it is noteworthy for us to understand that typology is not superstition. We read in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 verse 11, "Now these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of the ages has come." Clearly, according to this biblical verse, it appears a lot of things happened as precursors to happenings in the future. It fully consolidates the fact that even nations in our world now trace what they do from happenings in the past. One thing that I can promise you is that typology is really a biblical and historical framework in which real people and even real events become prophetic prototypes, or in other words, prophetic examples of greater future reality. And it's no surprise that even throughout the biblical record, people like Paul, being biblical writers, used type to refer to historical figures or even events representing something or someone from his own time. and the future. For example, when you consider Romans 5:14, it talks about Adam being a type who actually foreshadowed that which was to come, being Christ, the antitype. And as we move along, there are two very distinct examples, even in the Old Testament, which show indication that specific characters or even events are types of something to come. Let's delve deeper. When you look at David, for example, he was seen as a type according to Psalm 22 verse 1. When he was suffering, in fact, he actually was reminiscing what was about to happen to Christ. And before that happening to Christ, there was an antitypical advertisement. In other words, Jeremiah commented on the new David who was to come. In other words, he commented on another person who would have the same suffering experience, the agony, as David did in Psalm 22 verse 1. Which of course was in the person of Christ during his experience in Gethsemane. He had been the realization of what David had gone through in Psalm 22. Basically, the antitype Christ of the type David. It doesn't end there. The second example, as we see, the type being sacrifices in Leviticus, which were announced or commented on to be the suffering servant who was to come. Then, of course, this was realized in the death of Jesus, according to John 19. So clearly we see that the type being sacrificed was announced in the book of Isaiah and realized in the death of Christ. Two things happening here. The type and the antitype, then of course the catalyst or the announcer between them being the advertisement. Let's proceed, and I believe you are clearly getting the understanding now that in the same way, Joshua, of course, being the successor of Moses, became one of Scripture's most sophisticated types. He was a living, breathing foreshadowing of Christ himself. Let me give you a very interesting fact. Do you know that the Hebrew name Yehoshua, which is translated as Joshua, and Yeshua, which is translated as Jesus, are the same names? Well, let me break it into pieces. One means Yahweh saves. Joshua means Yahweh saves. And the other means Yahweh is salvation. The shadow already whispered the name of the substance. Wow. So clearly, just as prototypes in engineering, for example, are essential for the final design, just as even scientific models reveal the structure of deeper realities, so the life of Joshua becomes a divine preview of the person and work of Jesus. Well, we are just beginning. Let's delve deeper into typology classes. And here we try to discover very important facts, especially with regards to the Old Testament. Do you know that the types in the Old Testament point to three distinct kinds of antitypes, which are the Christ, the church, and the end times? Well, before you get confused, I have some visual aids to help you. Look at these. There is a type and there is an antitype. So first of all, we know clearly that one of the types we see throughout the historical records of the Bible is Israel. And Israel is pointing actually to three distinct antitypes. In other words, three distinct realizations of the things that Israel went through. Number one, of course, is Christ. And how do we know this? Christ realized what Israel went through by going to Egypt. You remember, Egypt was where Israel dwelt for more than 400 years. And Christ, when he was born, also was taken to Egypt, as you can confirm from Matthew chapter 2. He realized it. The church as well, which happens to be the new Israel, actually comes out of Egypt. In fact, the church is baptized out of the things that is classified as Egyptian. In other words, born anew from the things of old, coming out of Egypt. And finally, even in the end times, the Bible clarifies very important class of people as the 144,000 who are also taken out of Egypt. In other words, they are redeemed out of the world. They are antitypes of the historical Israel. Secondly, the Exodus also forms a type of what? Well, number one, of Christ. Remember that the people of Israel during the Exodus had to pass through the wilderness, the desert, for 40 years. In fact, according to Numbers chapter 11 and even Numbers 14 verse 34, clearly those 40 years were actually 40 days in biblical prophecy, which had been represented and actualized as years. God said one day would be for them 1 year. And Jesus Christ actually typified this. Christ was in the desert for 40 days. And it doesn't end there. The church also baptized and sustained by Christ. In other words, when the Israelites had the Exodus, they passed from Egypt through the sea, baptized, going into Canaan. The same way, the church follows the same order and typifies what the Israelites did in the Exodus. In the final times of the world, it is very clear that the church, even in the end time, would have to leave apostate systems. And by this, it is reminiscent of the Israelites leaving the apostate system of Egypt. Finally, and more importantly, another type that is very significant for even our salvation is the sanctuary. Now, how is this typified? In other words, how is this realized in future events? In Christ, he was like a temple amongst us. Remember, in John chapter 1 verse 14, we are told, and the word became flesh and dwelt amongst us. In fact, the basic word known as flesh is actually the similar root word known in Exodus 20, telling us, once again in Exodus 25, concerning the sanctuary being built. In other words, what really the Bible was saying is Jesus Christ tabernacled amongst us. He was realizing the temple. He was the antitype of the sanctuary. The church as well, as we have been told, is the temple of God. A real anti-typification of the sanctuary. Then finally, in the end times, the people of God will serve within the temple, typifying the sanctuary service during the sojourn of Israel. Wow, typology is indeed significant. But it doesn't really end there, because we get deeper into the real symbolism of Joshua himself. Joshua stood more than a military leader. As we have seen through the biblical discourses, his life formed a living blueprint of even a greater deliverer to come. Perfectly, like Moses, he received direct messages from God. He celebrated Passover. Joshua crossed the waters. He saw the angel of the Lord. His outstretched hand brought victory. He invited the people to remain faithful even after his death. And going through all this, it is very clear that Joshua carried out the instructions regarding the division of the land and even the cities of refuge. Conclusively, the people, and even now for us as studies continue, understand that Moses' prophecy extended beyond Joshua. When Moses said the prophet would lead the people, it was not only Joshua, but also referred to the real Joshua in Christ. Joshua was indeed the type of Christ. Then finally, as we have discovered, the antitype of Joshua is really Christ. In fact, the objective of the wars led by Joshua was to establish the Israelites in the promised land. And that is what we see as Isaiah presents the work of the Messiah as consisting of assigning the desolate inheritances. In other words, the same terminology that was used in Joshua is the same terminology that is used to describe Christ restoring the inheritances of the people. Wow, this is so wonderful. But let me ask you, in what sense is the life and work of Joshua, who is the type, reflected in the life and work of Jesus, who is the antitype? Well, number one, after his baptism in the Jordan, Jesus fought against the forces of evil. Remember, after Israel, led by Joshua, were baptized by passing through Jordan, they had to fight the Canaanites, in other words, forces of evil, to claim the promise. Again, Christ began to work after 40 days in the desert. Now, I don't need to explain this, because Joshua with the Israelites had the privilege to work in Canaan after 40 years in the desert. And you say, wow, really antitype. Again, Christ defeated the enemy on the cross. And by virtue of the sanctuary service, especially the sacrificial system at the cross, Joshua also defeated his enemies. Continuing, we know Christ gives us victory over our spiritual enemies. And of course, by meeting the angel, the commander of the Lord's army, Joshua gave victory after following the instructions to the Israelites. More importantly, Christ gives us true rest. The rest that God wrought through Joshua to the Israelites in Canaan is typified in this sense. And finally, he assigns to us incorruption. Wow. As we see in the whole sojourn of Joshua, the importance of the Exodus was realized in an incorruptible land where milk and honey flowed. Indeed, I want to be part of this wonderful typification by Christ. The final important bit for us is that Joshua actually is also a type of the church. Do you know that today we have a battle to fight? And we are led by our Joshua. We are led by the Christ who equips us with the necessary armor. And again, he assigns us an inheritance that is filled with spiritual blessings. In the end time as well, we know that the fulfillment, the full fulfillment, the typological fulfillment of Joshua is going to happen, where we all take full possession of our inheritance, a land where we can live in confidence. Until that time comes, it is imperative for us to live and realize that Joshua could lead Israel into an earthly Canaan, and Jesus leads humanity into the eternal one. Joshua brought temporary rest, Jesus brings the true rest, spiritual, eternal, and complete. Remember, typology is not an academic curiosity. No, it was and is a divine revelation. Through Joshua, God whispered the gospel long before Bethlehem's star ever illuminated the sky. Who is your true Joshua? I hope you know mine. See you next time.